Welcome to the season finale of The Deep Dive. This entire series, focusing on Schumpeter's monumental work, 10 Great Economists, it's really all been building up to this final, ultimate confrontation.
It really has.
We've looked at his views on the classical masters, the marginalists, and even his direct contemporaries, like Wesley Clare Mitchell, whose empirical approach we just covered in our last dive.
And now we finally turn to what is, without a doubt, the most significant intellectual duel of the 20th century. We are plunging into Schumpeter's definitive, deeply personal, and yet profoundly critical analysis of his greatest rival, his colleague, John Maynard Keynes.
And this essay, it's just a masterpiece of complex duality, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. On one hand, you have Schumpeter expressing this genuine, almost soaring admiration for Keynes's genius, his political effectiveness, but then on the other hand, he launches this fundamental rejection of the techno foundations and the long-term implications of the general theory.
That tension is exactly what makes this source so compelling. So our mission today is to really get into the source material to understand how Schumpeter could hold these two conflicting views, this deep admiration and this total rejection in, perfect balance.
And Schumpeter's critique of Keynes is, I think, the essential guide to understanding the two major competing poles of modern economic thought. You have the static, managerial approach versus the dynamic, revolutionary view.
It sets the stage perfectly.
It does. And Schumpeter, in his classic style, he doesn't start with the economics. He starts with the man, with his pedigree. He opens the whole thing by noting Keynes's unique sense of the importance of, and this is a quote, hereditary ability, the belief that ability runs in stocks.
That is such a Schumpeterian way to begin, all about breeding and background and innate talent. And Keynes certainly had the lineage to back that up.
He absolutely did. Keynes's background was, well, it was extraordinary. His father, John Neville Keynes, was an eminent logician. He was the author of Scope and Method of Political Economy, which, by the way, Schumpeter himself regarded as one of the best methodologies of economics ever written.
So he grew up surrounded by this rigorous, systematic way of thinking about how economics should even be done.
Exactly. The foundation was there from the very beginning. And his mother, Florence Ada Keynes, wasn't just some background figure. Schumpeter makes a point to highlight her exceptional ability, her charm, noting she eventually became the mayor of Cambridge.
So this wasn't just intellectual stock. It was deeply established, socially aware, politically engaged, Cambridge lineage through and through.
Precisely. Schumpeter is painting a picture for you. Here's a man who was inherently part of the British establishment, yet he was radical enough to turn its economic doctrines completely upside down.
I found it really telling that Schumpeter highlights Keynes' non-economic pursuits. He notes that few later honors pleased Keynes as much as his election as the master's representative on the governing body of Eton. Why that detail? It seems like a purely social thing.
But it speaks volumes about the complete man. Schumpeter is showing us that Keynes wasn't just some, dry economist scribbling equations. He was a cultural figure, a member of the elite who valued his place within that long tradition of English intellectual life.
So being elected by his peers at a place like Eton, it showed he was respected not just for his mind, but as a trusted steward of the culture.
A trusted steward. That's a great way to put it. Schumpeter admired that holistic genius, the man who could manage a college endowment, advise the treasury, write a revolutionary book, and fund a theater. He could do it all.
And that genius, it was apparent even before he really hit his stride, right? Schumpeter points to his earliest economic publication, Indian Finance and Currency, from around 1913.
He does. He rated it as the best English work on the gold exchange standard up to that point. And while the book was, on the surface, very technical, all about how money circulated in the British Empire, Schumpeter saw something deeper.
What was that?
The intensity of Keynes's focus on monetary phenomena, his whole attitude toward policy. It was already there. It clearly foreshadowed the approach he'd later develop in the Treatise on Money and then, of course, the general theory. Monetary dynamics were always the center of his universe, never the periphery.
And that keen focus on monetary management, it quickly vaulted Keynes right into the highest levels of public service. Which brings us to part one of our deep dive, from diplomacy to the diagnosis of capitalism's demise.
Right. His path culminates in this critical role on the Council of Four at the Paris Peace Conference after World War I.
He was the leading treasury expert, so he had this unparalleled front row seat to the negotiations, the political drama between Clemenceau, Wilson, and Lloyd George.
And the book that came out of it, The Economic Consequences of the Peace in 1919, was an immediate sensational international bestseller. It cemented his fame overnight.
But the book was just devastatingly critical of the treaty, especially the reparations imposed on Germany. And Schumpeter, he really leaps to Keynes' defense against the critics who came after him, specifically the accusation of poetic fantasy.
He's adamant about defending Keynes' truthfulness there. He stresses that the allegation that Keynes just, manufactured or exaggerated the motives of these leaders has absolutely no foundation.
So he wasn't just making it up for dramatic effect.
Not at all. Schumpeter points out that Keynes himself claimed no close relationship with Clemenceau or Wilson, and only a passing personal acquaintance with Lord George. He was just interpreting the events and discussions he witnessed in his official capacity.
It was a professional interpretation of what he saw firsthand.
Exactly. Schumpeter stressed that the book's interpretation is, quote, amply supported by independent evidence. And then he makes this fascinating psychological observation. He says Keynes' interpretation was distinctly generous and perfectly free from traces of any resentment.
That's incredible. So despite his intense anger over the policy outcome, his portrait of the men who made it was, in a way, intellectually fair.
Schumpeter deeply respected that detachment. And this political critique from 1919 leads us to the critical intellectual leap. Schumpeter argues the core vision of the later general theory isn't in the math, it's right here, in the social and economic diagnosis from the economic consequences of the peace.
This is the linchpin of the whole analysis, isn't it?
It's the absolute linchpin. The peace book gave him the worldview. The general theory gave him the analytical toolkit to make that worldview operative. Keynes argued that the whole period of laissez-faire capitalism, it had been an extraordinary episode in history, an episode that had effectively ended in August 1914.
An extraordinary episode, meaning a unique set of historical circumstances that allowed it to work but that weren't permanent. What were they in Keynes' view?
Two massive propelling forces. First, rapid population growth. That ensured a constantly expanding labor market. And second, and this is key, abundant opportunities to invest.
Okay, so a growing population and endless places to put capital to work.
Right. Schumpeter elaborates on that second point, saying these opportunities were incessantly recreated by technological improvements and by a series of conquests of new sources of food and raw materials. Capitalism thrived on endless expansion.
But the vision, the one that becomes the foundation for his stagnation theory, is that by 1920, those vital impulses were giving out.
That's the critical shift. The engine was sputtering, population growth was slowing, frontiers were closed, maybe the big technological leaps were stalling. So if investment opportunities are vanishing, what does that mean for the core virtue of the bourgeoisie?
Drift. Save.
Exactly. Keynes has this vivid description of them as always keeping on baking fakes in order not to eat them. This thrift, this saving, was once a vital engine. But if there's nowhere profitable to invest that capital, it loses its social function.
And it becomes actively destructive. Saving without investment just kills aggregate demand and leads to unemployment.
Precisely. And Schumpeter explicitly identifies this moment as the origin of the modern stagnation thesis. Keynes believed that mature capitalism was just inherently prone to stalling out. And Schumpeter argued that the general theory was the ultimate result of Keynes' long struggle to make that vision of our age analytically operative.
He needed a tool.
Yeah.
He needed a theory to prove his diagnosis was scientifically sound.
He needed the machine.
So the vision was set in 1919, the world was headed for stagnation. The next step was building the analytical machine, which brings us to part 2. The Unstable Bridge, the treatise on money from 1930. Schumpeter called it an attempt to bridge that gap between the vision and the technique.
And he used the term unstable bridge for a very good reason. The treatise was incredibly ambitious. It was this massive 2-volume effort to create a definitive analysis of the dynamics of price levels.
So not just what the price level is, but how it fluctuates, how the business cycle actually happens.
Exactly. He wanted to explain the way in which the fluctuations actually come to pass. He was aiming for a truly dynamic theory. But despite that ambition, Schumpeter calls it an ambitious failure, at least in terms of its core technical framework.
Analytically, it just didn't hold up.
Analytically, no. It was built on these concepts, these fundamental equations that just proved too cumbersome and difficult to apply. And Schumpeter points out that Keynes himself was quickly dissatisfied. He recognized he'd offered half-baked bread.
So he just abandoned the whole framework a few years later for the general theory.
He did, but Schumpeter still gives the treatise credit for an extraordinary achievement in one very specific policy-driven area.
Oh, what was that?
Policy foresight. Schumpeter says that Book 7 of the treatise contained all the essentials of Bretton Woods.
Wow, that's a stunning claim in 1930.
It's incredible. Over a decade before the Allies met to redesign the global financial system, Keynes had already laid out the blueprint for international monetary management. Stabilizing exchange rates, international reserves, it was all there. It just showed that Keynes was always intensely focused on tangible global policy outcomes.
And beyond the policy stuff, the treatise made some huge conceptual leaps that were necessary for the general theory. What were the two most critical breaks with classical thought?
Okay, so first, the treatise fully embeds the theory of money as the theory of the economic process as a whole. Money wasn't this neutral veil just lubricating transactions like the classicals often thought. For Keynes, money was active, it influenced real outcomes, it was central.
And the second, even more crucial leap.
It resolutely separated saving and investment decisions. This is huge. In classical economics, saving was just assumed to automatically become investment through the interest rate. The interest rate was the price that made them equal.
But Keynes broke that link.
He shattered it. He argued that the people doing the saving, the rentiers, the bourgeoisie, were totally different from the entrepreneurs doing the investing. Their decisions were governed by completely different motives, different time horizons. This separation was absolutely indispensable for his later argument that an economy could get stuck in equilibrium with high unemployment.
That distinction, saving and investment as independent acts, that's a revolutionary step. It just completely undermines the classical framework.
It is. But Schumpeter noted that Keynes did hold on to one crucial and potentially untenable idea from the old quantity theory.
Which was?
He points out that Keynes still treated the quantity of credit or money as an independent variable.
So he saw the money supply as something external, something decided by the banks or the government, and then just sort of given to the economy, rather than something that grows out of the economic process itself.
Exactly. Schumpeter felt that this was a legacy idea that really limited the analysis. It forced the framework to treat money as given, which is classic quantity theory. Schumpeter, who saw credit creation as an internal driver of the cycle, saw this as a major analytical shortcoming.
So it's like Keynes was so eager to move past the static classical model that he accepted one static piece, the external money supply, just to make his model of unstable demand work.
That is a brilliant way to put it. And, the sheer speed with which he recognized the failure of the treatise and just started over, building a new framework that was simple, logically consistent, and focused entirely on his vision. Well, that's what Schumpeter most admired about his intellectual drive.
That drive led directly to part 3, the apex of the argument. This is it, the ultimate confrontation. Schumpeter's assessment of the general theory of employment, interest, and money, and its deep limitations.
And Keynes comes out swinging. He claimed he was leading economists out of 150 years of error.
That's not just a tweak, that's a revolution.
Incredibly bold. It signaled he wasn't just modifying the system, he was overthrowing it. And the effort he put into forging this simple new model that expressed his vision, and Schumpeter says nothing else, was just enormous. He wanted something logically elegant, stripped down to its absolute essentials.
Schumpeter calls the result a cordon bleu sauce, made from surprisingly scanty material. Let's break down those 4 primary functions that Keynes treated as the independent inputs.
Right. These 4 functions uniquely determine the entire outcome of the system. So first, you have the consumption function. This just determines how much of a given income households will spend. Keynes treated this as pretty stable, especially in the short run.
And by treating consumption as stable, he immediately shifts the entire focus of what causes booms and busts onto the most volatile piece of the puzzle: investment.
Exactly. Which brings us to number 2, the marginal efficiency of capital function. This captures the expected rate of return on a new investment, and it's highly volatile because it depends on entrepreneurs' psychological expectations, what Keynes famously called animal spirits. This is the engine of instability.
Okay, so we have stable consumption, volatile investment. Then you have the wage unit and the liquidity preference function.
Right. The wage unit, function 3, is essentially the nominal anchor of the system. It's the money paid per unit of labor. It's what links the real economy to the money economy. And then the liquidity preference function, number 4, that's Keynes' theory of why people hold cash.
For transactions, precaution, and speculation.
Crucially, speculation. The demand for cash based on fear or the expectation that interest rates will rise is what drives the interest rate in the Keynesian model, not the supply and demand for saving.
So those are the 4 inputs: stable consumption, volatile investment, a given wage rate, and money demand setting the interest rate. And together, they uniquely determine the two big outputs, income and employment.
And Schumpeter acknowledged the logical elegance of it all. He admitted its architectural brilliance. It's simple, powerful, and complete within its own frame.
But
And here's where the intellectual gloves really come off. Because Schumpeter argues that this very elegance, this simplicity, demanded a severe conceptual restriction. A price had to be paid.
and what was the most severe limitation? The one Schumpeter really hammers home.
The fatal restriction, from a Schumpeterian perspective, is the assumption that the industrial apparatus remains unchanged. This assumption is the absolute hinge upon which the entire debate turns.
Okay, let's unpack that. What does assuming an unchanged industrial apparatus actually mean for how useful the general theory is?
It means the model is fundamentally static. Schumpeter argued the analysis is limited to governing the greater or smaller utilization of existing capital. The Keynesian model is designed to answer one single question. Given the factories and tools we already have, how do we get unemployed people back to work using them?
It's the economics of capacity utilization.
That's it. And what does that static focus necessarily exclude from consideration? This is the core clash with Schumpeter's entire life's work.
It excludes innovation. It excludes change.
It excludes everything incident to the creation and change in the industrial apparatus itself. So technological innovation, new goods, new methods of production, the entire process of creative destruction. All of it is systematically excluded from the model.
So if you're an economist like Schumpeter, who believes that dynamic entrepreneurial destruction is the heart of capitalism, then this static assumption is a fatal flaw. It makes the general theory useful only for, the very shortest of short runs.
Precisely. Schumpeter saw capitalism as an engine constantly remaking itself, churning through the old to create the new. When Keynes' model says, let's assume the factories are unchanged, Schumpeter is screaming, but the factories are constantly changing. They're being built and destroyed. That is the defining feature of the system.
If you exclude the core process of capital formation and destruction, Schumpeter argued, you've basically restricted the model's use to just a few years at most, the length of a typical downturn.
You've got it. Schumpeter is basically arguing that Keynes built a flawless machine for predicting how a depressed, static economy behaves. But in doing so, he made his model utterly incapable of explaining why an economy grows, or changes, or innovates in the first place.
It's the ultimate management tool focused on tuning the existing machine, but it's not a theory of economic evolution.
That is the precise critique.
All right, let's move from that technical architecture to its revolutionary effect. This takes us to part 4, the sociological achievement and the enduring legacy. Because Schumpeter recognized that Keynes achieved something almost unique in the history of economics. He created a genuine school.
And Schumpeter had a very strict definition of that word. A school isn't just a bunch of academics who agree on things. It's a group that professes allegiance to one master and one doctrine. It has watchwords, propagandists, technical doctrines for the insiders, and popular slogans for the masses. It becomes a social force.
And he says this is incredibly rare. He compares Keynes' success only to the physiocrats in 18th century France and the Marxists.
I mean, that speaks to the sheer scale of Keynes's impact. That Schumpeter puts him in the company of Marx is a testament to his ability to blend technical economics with a compelling revolutionary political message. It was his greatest sociological achievement.
And the most important impact of this movement was ideological. Schumpeter identifies the great ideological overthrow, the displacement of saving as the ultimate virtue.
This is a profoundly critical insight. Schumpeter believed that the defense of private thrift had become, in his words, the last pillar of the bourgeois argument for capitalism, upheld by Smith, Marshall, Pigou. This pillar justified restraint, delayed gratification, and even inequality, because the fruits of that thrift would eventually benefit everyone through more capital.
And Keynes just knocked that pillar right over.
He demolished it by showing that in a world without enough investment opportunities, his stagnation vision private saving could lead to social disaster. He completely flipped the moral script. He gave intellectual legitimacy to the idea that spending, even government deficit spending, was the virtue the economy needed.
It was the justification for the rise of the welfare state and proactive government.
It was. Schumpeter recognized that Keynes' work symbolizes, at least, even though it may not embody, what they wanted to see done for anyone seeking reform and a break from that old Victorian economic morality.
But even for people who weren't Keynesians, Schumpeter said the general theory had a salutary effect.
He did. He quotes a prominent American economist who said the book does not make us Keynesians, it makes us better economists. And that's Schumpeter conceding that the sheer intellectual force of Keynes' argument forced the entire profession to sharpen its tools, to examine its assumptions, to formalize its models with way more precision than before. It pushed the entire field forward, even for his opponents.
Then Schumpeter makes the really controversial statement that, like Marx, Keynes' analytical structure has an immunity to criticism.
Yes, and we have to be careful here. He isn't saying that immunity is a good thing. He's describing what he saw as a profound intellectual reality. He argued that the vision and the logical structure are so perfectly synthesized that the system can't be fatally injured, even if individual pieces are proven wrong.
Immunity. But isn't that just a fancy way of saying it's become a dogma that resists facts? Didn't he see that as a dangerous thing?
Oh, that is precisely the implication. He saw the risk. He says it's possible to admire Keynes even if you think his social vision is wrong, and every single proposition is misleading. The structure's power isn't just in the math, it's in its ability to express a deeply felt political need, the need to solve unemployment in this elegant, self-contained system.
So if one piece fails, the school just finds a way to patch it without questioning the whole building.
Exactly. They just find an updated, equally logical way to repair that one element without ever abandoning the core architecture. It makes it incredibly resilient, even if its foundations are, as Schumpeter argued, restrictive.
And finally, Schumpeter ends his analysis by appreciating the sheer breadth of Keynes' life. He goes back to the whole man.
He really emphasizes that Keynes' massive output of economic theory was just a fraction of his life's work. He was always operating in multiple high-pressure spheres at the same time. He was the bursar of King's College, managing their endowment with incredible success.
He also chaired an insurance company.
Chaired the National Mutual Life Assurance Society for years, proving his skill in practical finance. And his influence on British cultural life was just immense. He edited journals, but crucially, he founded and generously financed the Cambridge Arts Theatre. He was a major cultural patron.
Schumpeter mentions Keynes dashing off notes, saying if you want to know what he's really busy with, look at the theater's budget.
Yes. It was a reminder that he never allowed economics, however world-changing, to just consume his entire existence. Schumpeter admired this Renaissance quality.
The intellectual who could debate policy with the prime minister one day, discuss philosophy the next, and then manage a college's finances and fund a theater the day after that.
It was the embodiment of the highest form of the intellectual class Schumpeter respected. Keynes was a force of nature who profoundly shaped his age, regardless of whether Schumpeter ultimately agreed with him.
This has been an absolutely phenomenal deep dive and a fitting close to our series on 10 great economists. We've seen Schumpeter navigate this incredibly complex terrain. He fully appreciated Keynes's genius and his unmatched skill in building a system that delivered immediate policy answers for the Depression. But he also understood that this achievement came at a huge conceptual cost.
The cost of accepting what Schumpeter saw as fatally short-run and static assumptions. And that tension is permanent. Keynes gave us an indispensable technical apparatus for managing short-run employment problems. But that apparatus was purchased by excluding the messy, chaotic heart of dynamic capitalism that Schumpeter championed: creative destruction, technological change, capital formation.
Schumpeter's essay makes it clear. Keynes' entire triumph was predicated on accepting and then formalizing a specific vision of stagnation, this belief that the capitalist engine had run out of steam and needed continuous state management.
And that brings us right to the provocative thought that Schumpeter's analysis leaves us with. It's a challenge that continues to shape our policy debates right now, today. If the defining feature of modern capitalism is relentless, chaotic, and disruptive change, driven by the continuous creative destruction of entrepreneurs, how effective can an economic toolkit be in the long run if it relies fundamentally on assuming that the industrial structure remains entirely static?
It's the managers versus the innovators.
It's the critical divergence. The Keynesians, focused on demand management and tuning the existing machine, versus the Schumpeterians, focused on supply, creation, and destruction. And that is the fundamental challenge facing every economy. We have to decide, are we trying to manage the system we have, or are we trying to facilitate the constant, painful, but necessary birth of a new one?